And you can be spiritual, you can be Christian, you can be Catholic, and you can also be queer.
Yeah.
And those things can coexist, and it's beautiful to see those things coexisting.
Today, I have such a special guest for you here. Her name is Sharon Claros, Chia Claros, and she is at Pomona College, right? Claremont Colleges. And she is a student admin at the Queer Resource Center. She has been serving as a queer assistant advocate for many years now. I met her through MSU at Michigan State University, and over the years of just tagging along, having these conversations in other spaces, I'm so privileged to have her join us today. So thank you for joining, Sharon.
Thank you, John. I think you're, doing really important work and just kind of sharing our shared humanity and connectivity with each other through our stories and narratives. And so I appreciate you creating the space for us.
Oh gosh, again, I said this again. Pleasure's all mine, seriously. And Sharon, we definitely have a lot of shared experience. Not only were we Spartans at one point, hopefully you still got
Yes,
that green and
yes,
blue, okay?
I will
Yeah,
always be a Spartan. I will always bleed green.
bleed green. Yes,
MSU has a special place in my
yes.
heart. So
Yeah, I
yeah.
do miss it. I do miss it. One of these days, maybe if you'll join us over here in the Midwest again, you can come over here to
Yes.
Chicago, where I'm currently at, or
Yes, there's always a possibility.
somewhere else. But I'd much rather go over to where you're at Pomona College, because it's
Yeah,
Northern California.
California, Southern
Oh,
California. Yep.
all warm and sunny. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
So please tell me a little bit and introduce yourself a little bit for the audience, because you are a Cure Resource Center advocate and you're a student
Mhm.
admin. So you work exclusively, if not even with the broader community, on issues regarding trans rights, queerness, gay individuals on campus, and everything under the umbrella of LGBTQ.
Yes, yeah. So, hello everyone. My name is Sharon Chia Claros, and I use she, her pronouns. And I started at the Claremont Colleges 7 months ago. And so remotely working, serving the community as the assistant dean of students and the director of the Queer Resource Center. And so we serve students, faculty, staff of the Claremont colleges, and also, surrounding like local high schools with our outreach programs. And so it's all about really educating our community members on how to create more affirming and inclusive spaces for queer and trans students through outreach, programming, education, one-on-one connections, and really building relationships, centering on respect and love and community, compassion and understanding.
Yeah, I even checked out your website, and the statement goes like, we're here to be empathic and compassionate, listen, but also create brave spaces. And I think that's something that I didn't see so much in undergrad, using that term brave spaces instead of safe
Mm-hmm.
spaces. And so you definitely are including a lot of varied voices or individuals, even within your queer community, right?
Right,
And
right.
the one person that I need to talk about is you and your experience too. So I really want to hear about your experiences working with those students. But first, why don't we talk about your upbringing? What made you want to become a student admin in the first place? How does intersectionalism, which is another very key term, very big idea, right, that you're a proponent of, that was found on your site, what does that have to do with your upbringing and how did you get here?
Yeah, definitely. I think, being an immigrant, being born in the Philippines and being raised in a religious family. So my grandfather, Ananias Chia, was a pastor of our Iglesia ng Dios kay Cristo Jesus. Growing up, we worshiped like every Thursday and every Sunday in the actual house that I grew up in because we didn't have like a physical brick and mortar church yet,
Right,
right? And
right.
so So yeah, so like growing up in the Philippines, there wasn't really like education or conversations around like LGBTQI plus community in positive ways. When members of the community were brought up in conversations, it was always, to make fun of them, to make a joke
Mm,
out of them, like as a joke. And so there wasn't a positive connection and
right,
correlation to that.
right.
So coupled with, our, at least for my family, it's like the lighter you are the better, like you're more beautiful, intersections of,
Right.
colonization and
I get
like
that.
what is beautiful, what are gender norms, expectations, and so all that growing up, just kind of sent me different types of messages in terms of who I am, who am I supposed to be, what my roles are,
Mm,
as a cisgender woman,
right.
how my life is supposed to end up was already kind of written for me.
Mm,
And so coming to the US, I was able to, particularly in college, I was able to just really explore who I am authentically
mm,
outside of religion, outside of my family expectations, outside of, just kind of all these constructs. And so my identity as a woman and what that means, my identity as, a religious slash spiritual person. Like at the time, I was in Campus Crusade for Christ,
right, right.
and was doing ministry and all these things.
Wow.
And there was also something in me that I knew that was like different. And it started when I was in elementary school. There was a boy and a girl in my third, fourth grade classes that I graduated. We all graduated together, sixth grade. um, and Alexis and Oliver that I was like drawn to.
Yeah.
And I really didn't have the language, or the
Mm,
knowledge to explain, or I felt weird
right.
because all my other, girl classmates were saying that they had crushes on boys. No one ever mentioned that they were having crushes on girls. And so I already felt weird,
Right.
and outside the norm at that point. And it just kind of, I held that in me for like a really long time. And then it wasn't
Mm,
until college until I met other people who identify as lesbian or like
mm,
gay. Um,
mm,
and also in taking classes, women and gender studies courses, that I found scholars of color who were also queer.
mm.
Because at the time, in 99, when I first entered our LGBT resource center just to take a peek, all I saw
Yeah.
were white people,
Yeah.
in the space. And so I was like,
Right.
oh, like, is this gay thing or queer thing just for white people? Because I don't
Right.
see like
Intersect.
anyone who looks like me,
Yeah.
being in that space. And so again, it was just kind of suppressed. Who I was authentically was suppressed. I was still living at home with my family, and whenever we come home for the holidays, it's like,
Mm.
who's your boyfriend? When are you getting married? When are you going to get a kid? Just kind of those questions, like all the time.
Right. Right.
Yeah, and so yeah, so that just the intersection of coming from an immigrant family, like the very, strict and heteronormative and cisgender values,
Sure.
just kind of shaped like who I was supposed to be. And trying to live up to that, wasn't sustainable for me because I wasn't being who I am and who I feel like God created me to be.
Yeah. Yeah. You couldn't
I
follow that narrative that was set for you.
Right, I couldn't follow that. Like,
Yeah.
I honestly feel that, it's a trigger point for me when, people say like that I chose this lifestyle.
Mm.
Because for me, it's not a lifestyle. It's,
Right.
who I am, and it's, I honestly believe that God made me, in this way so that I can
Right.
serve a purpose in the lives of others,
Mm.
and to create like open mindedness, to
Mm.
open people's hearts about just the beauty of the diversity of, queer, trans people, the LGBTQIA plus community. And so, as queer people and being part of the queer community, like, we're not accidents. We're made to just kind of show the world that there's beauty in queerness, there's beauty in identifying as LGBTQ, there's
Mm,
creativity in that, there's a sense of resilience.
mm,
And so it's been a journey just in terms of unearthing that internalized homophobia, that internalized racism,
mm,
specifically related to like whiteness and like standards of beauty, and what that looks like. And so it's been definitely like a process, and
mhm.
finding and creating my chosen family outside of biological blood family
Right.
was really important and crucial for my developing my authentic self. And then also learning from other queer and trans ancestors and learning their stories. That's a part of our history, I believe, right? But all those things, I had to seek out for myself. They weren't in elementary school curriculum, they weren't in the high school curriculum,
Right.
outside of gender studies or
Yeah.
LGBT studies, they weren't even in college curriculum.
Right. Right.
um and so it's, yeah, so it just kind of, I kind of rambled on, but
No, that's
um
great because there's
yeah.
a lack of resources, lack of outlets for people like yourself when you're growing up, having all these questions. For me, I came out to my friends in high school. I was questioning, very similar to you, probably like around 11 or 12, and
Mhm.
experimenting with my sexuality, understanding who am I, not just, okay, child of immigrants like yourself,
Mhm.
Chinese, and being raised in a semi-Christian household, just like going to church maybe a few times throughout the year, that definitely resonates with me. Now, it's funny that you brought up this idea of queerness because Audre Lorde is someone who definitely took a huge brunt of the legwork, we would say, throughout
Mhm.
the history of queerness in the last century, talking about these idea of what it means to be a woman, what it means to be gay, what it means to
To be black.
perpetuate, yeah, be black and
Mhm.
perpetuate certain types of stereotypes or narratives. And it's a very fascinating take. Now, I have plenty of friends who don't really fully understand. I wouldn't say I fully understand, where Audre Lorde and these types of radical feminism types are coming from entirely. So, can you help explain what queerness means and what queer theory is, where it comes from? What is your sense of it?
Yeah, so I think, going back to my LGBTQ like studies courses and things like that, I think like queer theory was just kind of like an outcome of Michael Foucault's work, like
Mm,
Adrian Rich.
mm,
And it's really, and then there's like other scholars and authors who have kind of added on to queer theory. So even then, right, when I was taking queer theory as a course, the voices that were centered were white folks, right? Because like Michael Foucault and
mm,
Adrian Rich, they were white scholars, right? And so
right.
where are the Audre Lordes, in terms of introducing, their scholarship and their voices? Where's the James Baldwins of the world?
Mm,
And so, or Sherry Moraga. So, why aren't they kind of highlighted even in college, right?
right.
And I know this, this was in the 90s, late 90s,
Yeah.
and so
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure things have changed now, but at least in
Oh,
within
definitely.
my experience, um, it's been like the white scholars whose voices were uplifted and who were put out there, right?
Mm,
And so, but anyway, so for me,
mm,
and people define queerness in different ways, and that's the for me that's the beauty about queerness,
mm.
is that
Okay.
like it's ever evolving, it's ever changing, and
Mm,
so and there's room for creativity in terms of your queer expression,
mm,
right? And so it's just a world of beauty and possibilities. So it's both a political and personal identity for me. And so, me embracing a queer identity also means that like I care about like systems and structures
right.
that aren't necessarily made for queer and trans people.
Right.
And I'm using the term queer as an umbrella
Right.
that encompasses, the LGBTQIA plus community. Um, and so it's being conscious of like how, heteronormativity and cisgenderism has affected our policies, our institutions, lifespan for different community members within the queer community, specifically the trans community.
Mm,
And so there's that political kind of like aspect of it, and a reimagining of what society can look like if we
mhm,
center the voices of queer and trans
mm,
community members. And then to further break it down in terms of the sexuality piece, right? Because when you're looking at demographics forms of sexual orientation, they're like gay, lesbian, queer, bi,
mm.
pansexual,
Right,
demisexual, sapiosexual.
right, right.
There's, again, the expansive nature of queerness is
Yeah,
beautiful, right? Because people can choose to self identify.
sure.
And for me, in terms of my sexuality, my queerness means that, I don't care for what the biological, or I don't really care how a person like identifies in terms of like their gender identity or their sexuality. Like for me, being queer means that I have the freedom and the capacity to choose who I'm with based on my like physical, emotional, spiritual, like intellectual attraction and connection to them.
Mhm,
And so I'm not going to limit myself. So
mhm,
whether that person is non-binary or a cis man or a cis woman,
mhm,
or whether they are poly or
mhm.
identify as queer or bi or just
Right,
gay or lesbian
right.
or none
And
of
just
those
to
things.
say, poly means polyamorous. Is that what you're referring to?
Yes, yeah,
Right,
polyamorous, yeah,
right. So
yeah.
having
So
multiple different partners.
right, exactly. And so for me, my queerness in terms of my sexuality is, expansive in the sense that if, you're a human being,
Mhm,
and we connect on all those different levels,
mhm,
then I will explore that relationship, and that partnership with you.
mm. Queer theory then is this ever evolving type of ideology, would you say? And
Yes. And a worldview, I would
a
say too,
worldview.
a worldview, a perspective, in the sense of really questioning heteronormativity,
Mm,
questioning the ways in which we were socialized within the binary notions of cisgenderism,
sure. Yeah.
like biologically men, women, and it like limits inherently the ways in which even we go about living our life. It limits the ways in which we may interact with other people, right?
Mhm,
Because depending on how we were socialized and the messages that were taught
mhm,
unconsciously, that
right.
affects how we act in the workplace, in relationships, like etc.
Mhm,
And so queer theory and embracing kind of like a queer ethos
yeah.
of creating multiple possibilities outside of the very restrictive, gender binary, the
Sure.
very restrictive, like heteronormative, binary as well, right? Because
Right.
right now society is like, okay, you're either gay or straight, right?
Mm.
Like, I mean, in terms of
I get
the
what you mean.
majority of
Yeah.
society, right? And so
Totally.
it's always either or.
Mhm,
Like, there's not a notion of expansiveness of creating this world of like possibilities that's so beautiful,
yeah.
and we restrict ourselves based on society's expectations, and so
Sure.
queerness breaks those societal expectations, and to create worlds of beautiful possibilities in
Mhm,
community with other people.
right. So, from my knowledge, I think of the Frankfurt School, thinking about deconstruction, thinking about Simone de Beauvoir, these are leading feminists and thinkers, critical theorists, right? Critical theorists who thought to not dismantle, but it felt like the whole world was essentially dismantled through some of their theories. What did we perceive of ourselves, our sex, our gender, and of
Mm-hmm.
others? How do we orient ourselves with regard to our partners, our spouse, and children, and our work, right? So I definitely can see the value of that because sometimes some things aren't a given, right? It's not just
Right.
because you were born this way, you have to live this way. Like that's maybe one narrative, one story. Now, I think we're talking in very academic terms. So for those who are watching who might have like a hard time understanding, wait, what does this all mean? Like critical theory, feminist theory, like Sounds like hogwash to me, you know. So how do you make sense of it given your experiences, either working with students, working maybe even outside of academia? How do you see the purpose and the value of this work being played out?
Yeah, I think, for me, at the end of the day, the purpose and value of this work is really to give human beings, the people that we're around, the possibility and the opportunity to be the best versions of themselves
Hmm.
authentically. And it boils down as simple as that.
Okay.
How can we create affirming environments in our personal relationships, in our work settings, so that each individual human being that we interact with can be the best versions of themselves.
Mm,
And so I think that in any work, like, I hope that
mm,
that's what we strive to do, is to be in community with, and really realize that we are in this collective kind of, collective community, that what we do and how we act affects another person's
mm,
life, affects how they view themselves, affects how they navigate the world, college environments, relationships, like, etc.
mm.
um, so I think I would, yeah, just kind of, you know just what can you do to give that person you're interacting with, an opportunity to be the best person, the best version of themselves as they can be,
Right.
their most authentic self.
Great. Well, then, speaking as someone who is a lesbian and cisgendered woman who is a Christian, I think putting more emphasis on the last identity, you have a worldview, you have your faith values, as do I. That drives your work. I'm sure it comes alongside of that. I think
Yes, definitely.
how can you say you are inadvertently helping people or directly helping people fulfill their best self, right? Self actualization in some way through your work if it's just so evolving in a sense. There's no terms or goals or certain goalposts, right? And what does that look like in a very, very tangible way, I would say? How does that look like? You know, how did you help an individual at college or in your own life? How did you witness that type of change, that exploration of their queerness or their identity, sexual, gender, otherwise, build them to
Yeah,
a person?
definitely. I think that it's, as a person, again, who identifies as queer, spiritual, grew up in a Christian and Catholic household,
Right.
um, and, living an authentic life and being who I am and who I was created to be.
Mm-hmm.
In doing that, and living life in that way, and not being ashamed, or embarrassed because of my queerness and my sexuality and, like, who
Mm-hmm.
I am, gives people, like, an opportunity to also, live in their truth. And so, like, an
Mm.
example I can give you is very personal to me. My One of my family members, one of my nephews, actually, came out to me, as bi. And he just, randomly, like, text me one time on, like, National Coming Out Day.
Mm.
This was before coming out as bi, and he shared, hey, I just found out that today was, National Coming Out Day. Happy National Coming Out Day, Tita Sharon. And I was like, oh, thank you. Like, it's, and he has met, some of my partners.
Right.
And I don't hide who I am in my family, no matter
Right.
how religious they are.
Right.
And so I think it was like 2 years later after that text, he was like, hey, Tita Sharon, I think I'm bi.
Yeah.
And,
Wow. 2 years.
like, yeah. And, like, I don't know, like, should I come out to my parents? Should, like I
Right.
not? Like,
Right.
what
Mm.
does this mean for me? And also, and I was like, there's no right or wrong way of, coming out. Like, if you feel safe in doing so, you just have to, like, listen to your heart. My coming out story may be different from yours. You
Mm-hmm.
know, my parents' reactions may be different from your parents' reactions. And so, but just know
Mm-hmm.
that, you know, we're here to support you.
Mm-hmm.
I'm here to support you in ways that you need to be supported. And so, you know, he wanted like gay stuff, like
Yeah.
shirts and stuff like that for like Christmas, for birthdays. And so I would send it to him
Oh
because,
wow.
you know, his parents,
I'm a really bad gay or queer person because
yeah.
I don't have any rainbow stuff. And
Yeah,
I
and
think
that's totally fine, right?
it
There's
might be
no right
fine
or
for him.
wrong way, but
People.
you know, for
Yeah.
him and his identity, that it was important for him to have those symbols.
Right.
And
For
that's
sure.
the beauty of our journey as queer people. Like there's no right or wrong way of being queer or gay,
Hmm.
right? Yeah, and so I think that's just, you know, like an example of just kind of how, as individuals, if we live in our truth and authenticity, we show others that, you know, kind of gives them permission to do so, especially if
Hmm.
they haven't seen that in their lives. And so in the work that we do, you know, like at the QRC, it's definitely, um, we see it in tangible ways in terms of, you know, helping students navigate the college environment, and their experiences in college, in ways that they can, you know, create their chosen family, their community, in ways that they can hopefully do more than just survive in the college setting, but like really thrive
Right.
and build relationships with faculty and staff, and see their future selves as
Right.
thriving as a queer person, as a non-binary person, as a trans person. That, you know, a successful future being who you are authentically is possible. And we create those possibilities within the center and within the queer faculty and staff that we partner with. And you know, and then making sure that they are supported in ways that they need to be supported,
Mm-hmm.
because each queer person, trans person are not going to need the same support, right? Because they're individuals. And so we
Right.
really need to be intentional in the ways in which we provide our services and our support and how we interact with other people.
Sure. Wow. So a few things on that. I I want to get to your coming out story because I think that's something that you do, I'm sure, on a daily basis with a lot of your students that you work with, encouraging them in that because you've gone through it yourself and without the help a lot of times,
Mm-hmm.
I
Mm-hmm.
recall.
Yeah, so in terms of, you know, my coming out story, I think that I realized that something was different, you know, about me, like I said, back in like third or fourth grade,
Yeah.
when I was, you know, attracted to and was interested in knowing, you know, my classmates, one boy, one girl,
Right.
in a deeper way, and like really wanting to like learn more about who they are and just being excited to be around them. um and you know, like I said, that was repressed because of um the silence in the curriculum and the lack of acknowledgement and the lack of validation in terms of like the books we were reading in elementary school. Like there was like nothing back then, you know, like in the 80s, because I immigrated here when I was 7, so that was like 1987.
Wow.
So there was like nothing, right? And so the erasure of LGBTQ folks and their histories and their narratives, I think, you know, kept me repressed in like who I was. And again, and then like in high school, I went to an all girl Catholic high school. Um, and, you know, I always, that was the only time that I was like, oh, you know, like I have a crush on Angelina Jolie, and like my friends, my other girlfriends were like, well, who doesn't, you know? And
Right.
so it was just kind of like signaling to them that like, hey, something's different about me. But
Right.
like, they were like, well, you know, like I'd make out with her too. Like she's
Yeah.
hot, right?
Yeah. So
Um,
what would distinguish their attractions to Angelina Jolie and yours?
right. Yeah. And so like you know, I didn't come out in high school either. And
Yeah.
so yeah, I guess like
So you
at
just kind
least,
of conflated that. You just,
yeah, I
oh,
just
I'm
kept,
just like them. sort of
Right,
maybe.
exactly. I'm just kind of like them. Yeah, like
Yeah, yeah,
everyone has the hots for her, like
right,
whoever
right,
you are.
right.
And so that was just kind of that phase. And within the Catholic school setting and like teachings about the value system, the Catholic social teachings and things like that. It's rooted in justice, it's rooted in
Mm-hmm.
respect, it's rooted in love, right? And so I think going to Catholic school all my life until I went to college, those values of, centering the way that we live our life and how we interact with people, rooted and centered in love,
Mm-hmm.
was really something that I like took with me, right? All religions, like if you're Jewish, if you're Catholic, Christian, Muslim, Buddhist, etc., there is this core component of love.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel that, you know, um, fallible human beings kind of take that out of context when they create like dogmatic messages about
Mm-hmm.
LGBTQIA folks,
Yeah. Like
things
those
like,
maybe more Orthodox Jews or Muslims and Christians.
yeah. So
Yeah.
like when I hear um, religious leaders within the Christian or Catholic community say that, um, like love, love the sinner, hate the sin, or something like that, or
Yeah, yeah. Love the sinner, hate the sin. Yeah.
yeah.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
so,
Attitude that's more.
it's
Yeah.
like, what does that even mean? And yeah, and I mean, like, I think I've shared this with you before, but the word
Yeah.
homosexuality wasn't actually found in the Bible, in any of the Bible writings,
Right.
teachings, in any of the books until 1946.
Mm-hmm.
And so, for those who are interested in kind of learning more about that and how the word homosexual and homosexuality was created to be this, this bad thing and this like ungodly thing.
Sure.
It didn't appear in the Bible until 1946, and
Mm.
so the documentary is actually
Coming up
called
soon.
1946.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
um,
People
and
should
so
check
it's
it out.
this,
Yeah.
yeah, it's fascinating, like
Right.
how even the hatred for LGBTQ people were created by men, right, and not necessarily by God
Sure.
and
Yeah.
the higher being and stuff, because the ethos and the centrality of all religions, I feel, is centered and rooted in love. And so
Mm-hmm.
how can you love someone and and quote unquote send them to hell right away because they're LGBTQI
Right.
plus? I mean,
Right.
one of
Right.
my family members, in terms of my coming out, said that, like, oh,
Yeah.
like the Bible says it's wrong, you're going to go to hell, you're not going to be
Right.
saved, like.
I recall that's even your own father, wasn't it?
No,
No,
it wasn't my, yeah, that wasn't my dad. It was
that
one
wasn't
of
your
my,
dad.
it was one of my
Wow.
titas. Yeah, it's
Oh,
one of my titas. Yeah.
is that your
Um,
aunt in
yeah, that's
Philippines?
aunt. Yeah, tita
Okay.
is a aunt in Tagalog. So,
Oh, okay. Gotcha.
yeah, and my dad, when I came out to him, it was like a 7-year process. And
Right.
so different points throughout that 7 years, and I decided to come out to him when I knew that I was going to be financially stable, in
Right.
terms of like that I can support
Bit
myself
of a safety
financially.
net. Yeah.
Yeah, and that was my privilege too, right? Like as a cisgender person, even though I was, just dealing with other like mental health issues, like in the back of my mind, I knew that my family was going to be there, and that, me waiting until I can support myself financially, is something that I decided to do,
Mm.
because I was afraid that like I would be, I don't know, kicked out of the family or
Ostracized. Yeah.
ostracized, like whatnot. And so I didn't actually come out to my dad until I graduated from my master's program.
Mm.
And that was, I think, in 2004.
Mm-hmm.
Or wait, no, six. No, 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 that was 2006.
2006. Okay.
Yeah, so I was 26 the first time that I came out to my dad. And just year after year after year. And a lot of just really like really rough conversations in terms of at one point he blamed me going to American school to, because he thought that um, the education system taught me this thing, and just kind of
Sure.
trying to find a scapegoat or trying to
Like at
understand how.
university or like
Yeah,
counseling?
the university system. Yeah, so he thought that going to college in the US made me
Yeah,
the way that I am.
right.
And that, if I were to have gone to college in the Philippines, I probably wouldn't have turned out this way.
Yeah,
And
sure.
so, yeah, and so I was like, oh, that's an interesting
Yeah,
concept. But I also had to understand that even though I was going through my process, I also
right,
needed to take a step back and try to understand that my dad was going through his process as well.
right,
Like
right. Yeah,
finding out and trying to understand, that what being queer meant
mm,
and what does it mean for, his daughter, and like his expectations of me and his kind of the way that he has already written my life in terms of marrying a man and giving him grandkids. Like there's a death, right, for him, and
yeah,
there's a grieving.
yeah.
And I mean, I don't know, and I can't tell you 100% sure to this day, and I'm 40 now.
Mm,
Came out to him first when I was 26.
right,
I
right.
don't know if he fully I don't know if he's given up the fact that I will eventually end up with a man and give him grandkids, right? And
Yeah,
so even though I've been out since I was 26 and now I'm 40,
yeah,
like that's just something that I have to make peace with,
right.
right? In
Yeah,
terms of where he is at in his process, and because he needed to do a lot of unlearning. And when I came out to him, I think he was in his 50s or something, like
sure.
past 50s. And so that's 50 plus years of unlearning
Mm,
the ways that he was socialized and the ways that he viewed the world. And so there's also a responsibility that I put on myself in terms of really meeting him where he's at, and trying to understand, where he's coming from and why he thinks the way that he does. But then at the end of the day, I know that he still loves me,
mm,
although he might not understand, right? And
right.
so I think the spirituality piece comes
Yeah,
in that sense of like, accepting, and being grateful that, he's still here and that we still have this relationship,
mm.
and focusing on those blessings, rather than just kind of like,
Cutting
I
off
don't
the
know, like
relationship or
cutting off or like canceling. Our cancel culture is huge
of
nowadays.
course.
Like,
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
not,
It's
I
not
don't
something you
know.
want to get yourself in. I don't either. That bitterness, it's not healthy. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, yeah. And so yeah, I mean, you always come out. I mean, there's, family that Filipino families are
Mm.
huge. Like, you
Yeah.
have
Oh, yeah.
extended families. It's not just your nuclear family, right? You have your
Right.
titas, you have your cousins. Like,
And
I
just
know.
your friends who are Filipino.
Exactly. Yeah, and so it's just kind of like a constant, just kind of, coming out or inviting people into your life that will give you a positive energy and will affirm who you are without judgment. And
Mm,
so yeah, so this notion of coming out versus inviting people in
right.
is also something that, because for a lot of people, like coming out, it might not be for them, right? Like maybe
Sure.
coming out is a social construct that white people made, right? In terms of like pride, and like you have
Yeah.
to be proud of who you are.
Right.
So versus coming out,
Uh-huh.
I think folks are now also considering inviting people in,
Right.
so that they don't have to, they choose who
Yeah.
they
They
want to
choose
invite
to
into
instead of
their
just being
life and
the
their
glitter
authenticity.
loud.
Right, right,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
like myself, you know my story. I definitely have my Christian faith, and we have different interpretations, in terms of our sexuality and how we want to live our lives. And I think that's the beauty of it too. Like you said, with queerness, I typically don't use labels. I'm not a label guy, so I
Mm-hmm.
just feel like there's so much of John Chen that is just John Chen, and
Right.
for you, Sharon, of Sharon Claros, that
Mm-hmm.
queerness or gay doesn't really embody, at least for me. And I definitely respect you for being so bold with your parent, with your dad, because that's really, really hard thing to do. And I was so fortunate to have my parents be very understanding. They said it was a phase, like I think
I
that's a
think my dad still thinks it's a phase,
right,
to be honest with you.
right,
Like,
yeah, yeah,
yeah, yeah.
yeah. And I think I get where he's coming from when he says, "Oh, if you were raised in a Filipino culture," I don't know if he said it in this voice in a derogatory
Mhm.
tone or not, but we were given these opportunities to be able to assess, okay, what is my sexuality like? I probably would not have thought about it as much
Yeah.
if the boys in my classroom didn't call me gay, if I didn't have these media outlets and so forth to show me, like these
Mhm.
different lifestyles I could be living.
Mhm.
And so I did believe in that. I didn't really have my Christian faith at that point in high school, and I lived a pretty average, I would say, life. Still trying to figure my sexuality, my identity out. And it wasn't until going to college that I took my faith very, very seriously and started understanding, okay, what does the Bible actually say about this topic of sexuality? Of course, we've come to different, ideas of what that means for both of us and what God wants for us.
Mhm.
But I can definitely respect you as someone who identifies as a lesbian, has a partner, and still treats Christians, like myself, and conservative people like your father or your community with respect and open
Yeah,
minded,
definitely.
right?
Mhm.
That's really lacking in our
Mhm.
current generation.
Yeah, and I think the beautiful thing about it is that there have been, like, for example, at the Claremont colleges we have a queer Bible study that meets, that's
Wow.
started even before I got there, and they're now starting their Bible studies like every Tuesdays, right?
Wow.
And for queer people
Yeah. That's so
who
cool. That's so
is who their religion and their spirituality is a huge part of
right.
who they are. And in terms of like larger community resources, the metropolitan community churches is very queer friendly. Like, I think most of the people that go there here, at least in LA, is
Right.
queer, like, or a member of the LGBTQ community, their
Right.
pastors, their ministry, like Agape, like International Spiritual Center here in LA too. Like,
Yeah.
they have like an LGBTQ ministry, right? And
Right. Right.
so it's not like an either or. You can either be like Christian and religious or be queer and like
Mhm.
not have those two identities that are central to who you are coexist, right? It's a both and. You can be spiritual, you can be Christian, you can be Catholic, and you can also be queer.
Yeah.
And those things can coexist, and it's beautiful to see those things coexisting.
I think what was brought up earlier about the incongruence sometimes of the ideas within the queer community, you having all these experiences at Claremont colleges, these Bible studies ran by queer individuals, and you're participating in that. Agape, this big church organization that has these outlets for queer and LGBTQ individuals, that's something that I hope that my communities are able to adapt in some way. Now, they're traditional, we share a traditional sexual ethic in terms of, one man, one woman, the
Mm-hmm.
idea. But in some sense, you still have that question for yourselves in the queer community of how do we get along? Because I think you know this personally, like there are very new ideas always being brought about, within the progressive and liberal ranks. Because I mean, I do research. I'm working in a lab, managing a lab, and we're all about new ideas. Now, some new ideas maybe not as helpful. Some new ideas very, very helpful, engaging for our communities. How do you find this issue of, again, the trans identity? We kind of circumvented, and then we're coming back around hopefully here. How do you talk to people or make sense of students who come to you who are trans, who are trying to figure themselves out, who may detransition, in months to come? I'm very passionate about this because one of the labs I'm working at is studying gender dysphoria, the
Mm-hmm.
medical idea, concept that drives a lot of the transitioning that you see nowadays.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I would be more conservative in the sense that there are people's mental health, their emotional, physical health on the line in terms of treatment. So we want to be able to understand what is this gender dysphoria? What is their sense of lack of identity and feeling like their identity doesn't match up in terms of their gender and their biology. And we don't have all the answers, as researchers. We don't.
Mm-hmm.
There's so many people
Yeah.
at MSU, Jay Puckett, who doesn't agree with Michael Bailey, who I work with. And so they are cutting edge sexual researchers but they don't agree on that. So as we're trying to figure out these new ideas, I think people are trying to wrap their heads around how do we use pronouns in a very, very cohesive and respectful way, and are we being understanding as Christians and conservatives to those who identify as LGBTQ plus, right? And what you hopefully can answer for me is that idea. How do you reconcile the incongruence sometimes within the newness of ideas? Because you have the binary, and then you have trans individuals who may come to you and they're trying to figure themselves out. You're allowing them to become better individuals. How do you do that? That seems like so perplexing and nebulous.
Yeah, I mean, we just, in terms of giving and creating that space for our students to be the best versions of themselves. Going back to gender dysphoria, I just want to share that, like, not all trans and non-binary people experience gender dysphoria. I think,
Right.
like, that's, a huge myth that, like, there's something wrong with them psychologically. There's something wrong with a trans or non-binary
Right.
person, and you slap a very, like, outdated, like, DSM-4, like, diagnostic mental health stuff. In reality, trans and non-binary people don't experience, a lot of them, some do, but a lot of them don't experience gender dysphoria, right? And so
Interesting.
how do we create stories, research, articles, studies that also focus on that experience and not just on
Mm-hmm.
trans and non-binary students, who are diagnosed with gender dysphoria,
Do you ever feel like that
because
trivializes?
not all of
Or,
them, yeah, not all of them experience gender dysphoria.
right.
And so I don't want, society to always couple gender dysphoria with trans non-binary people,
Of course. Yeah.
right? Think it's really important for, colleges, universities to have gender affirming care, within their health services, and
Mm-hmm.
so, to provide gender affirming, hormones, or, gender affirming, like, support, in the medical field,
Sure.
um, and to respect people's, chosen name, to respect the pronouns that they want to use. Again, all going back to wanting to affirm and value the person for who they are, and the type of kind of relationship that we build with them should be centered on respecting them, as they come to us in their wholeness and in their identity.
Mm-hmm.
um yeah, and so, I mean, there's still, within communities of color, right, like, we have difficulties and conflicts in terms of, the ways in which we talk about race.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of anti-blackness within a PETA community, and so I use I use communities of color as an analogy to say that, not everything's perfect within the LGBTQIA plus community either, right?
Right.
Similarly to communities of color, our relationships with each other are not perfect, and we're
Totally.
constantly working on it, and we're
Right.
constantly trying to get to that place of mutual understanding and really embracing you know our collective community, and try to understand where each other is coming from, because we do have that shared humanity and shared experiences. um, and similarly with the LGBTQI plus community, the queer trans community, you know um, I can't tell you that all cis lesbian, all cisgender gay people understand the experiences of non-binary and trans community members, right? And so, I think, for me, in terms of really just kind of like centering the needs of trans and non-binary community members, um, is something that, we should really focus on, because if you look at the different, like, studies and, the data that's out there that's been collected in terms of, 41% of trans non-binary students, according to the Trevor Project, have attempted suicide, in comparison to, like 20 something plus percent of cisgender gay and lesbian, right?
Yeah.
Because society wasn't made for trans and non-binary students to thrive. There's all these barriers and this administrative violence, right? Through policies, through institutional forms, the way that things are created in laws, there's this administrative violence that reduces their lifespan and reduces their mental health.
So would this trans be inclusive of those who are gender dysphoric, or you said non-binary? So
Yeah,
what
I
is
think all, like, yeah, like,
all?
yeah, because I mean, when we, I think, like, I don't know if research and the ways in which demographic data is captured by,
Right.
institutes like the Williams Institute out of UCLA that does LGBTQ policy analysis work, or the Trevor Project, or the Family Acceptance Project, when they send out this research, rightly so because of HIPAA, they don't ask whether or not trans and non-binary people are experiencing gender dysphoria, right? And so it's like a collective. And I'm assuming that these numbers, in these numbers are folks who have experienced gender dysphoria and also folks who don't have gender dysphoria.
I work with some of my colleagues, and I no expert by any means. Again, assisting in research, running the lab and such. One of my colleagues, Lisa Littman, she has famous papers on detransitioning and also parent reports. Now, parent reports are limited because you're not getting reports from the youth. That set
Mm-hmm.
aside, plenty of, a lot of the studies actually that were proponents for gay marriage, in 2015 for Oberfell used parent reports. So it does tell us something about what the children experience. And right now, there is a lack of research on this issue. And what I fear, in positions like yourself in institutions like in academia, we are making very, very rushed decisions on
Mm-hmm.
how to treat people with gender dysphoria or who are just trans, who may use cross-sex hormones, who may transition sexually, medically. And there is a huge pool of young girls, actually, as Lisa Littman, Ken Zucker, and others have documented, right, that have been coming in droves, transitioning medically. So a lot of them have actually questioned their transitioning experience and have
Mm-hmm.
thus detransitioned a good chunk of people, right? So this is worrisome in some sense because one of the stories from Abigail Schreier's book, Blake, as they identify, they I don't know if they detransitioned, but they had a hysterectomy at 19, right? Because of
Mm-hmm.
their treatment and hormones that they were taking. So the FDA hasn't approved of hormone therapy, and that's a huge conundrum. We want to be supportive. How do we be
Mm-hmm.
supportive? There's a high suicidality risk, but we don't know even long term. There's mixed reports and studies on the effects of transitioning. Right?
Mm-hmm.
There's no clear answer. So
Yeah, I
how do you,
think
how do you make sense of that?
yeah, I think, we are giving agency to the person as an individual, right? You know, as a cis person with a lot of privilege, I don't know what it's like to be non-binary or trans. And the ways in which we approach the gender affirming care that we, like, we're trying to give, is through informed consent, right? And so there are ways in which you are affirming the identity of the trans non-binary person and also educating that person about, like, potential side effects and like the risks. And as as adults and as human beings who have ownership of their life and who can make decisions, um, at that current moment in their time, in their college career or wherever they're at in their identity. Who are institutions to deny them of that gender affirming services?
So do you
And
think that professionals, people who are healthcare professionals, should be able to give that advice and direction if they themselves feel that way? I mean,
yeah, there's an
it's not
informed
clear.
consent model versus versus like the very for some folks it is just kind of like harming, and it causes harm to, like, hey, like, show me a diagnosis from like a doctor, a mental health provider that says that um that says that like you are seeking counseling already and things like, you know what I'm saying, like
Sure.
it's
Right. I think one of the problems that I've come to face within the research is that Lisa Littman, and her work, as well as Ken Zucker, have seen cases where, many cases actually, in Lisa's work, about, I remember like 40-50% of those kids, right, and
mhm
young adults, they they didn't really have any deep analysis of their medical history, past trauma, or even any contact with their parents, especially for the youth in these cases. So the doctors would give them that right, or in even one case I recall from Lisa's work, one of the girls wanted to transition, and she didn't even really probe the doctor. Hey, I want to become the other sex, or I want to transition.
mhm
So the doctor just gave her a prescription. Not even, hey, this is a no, go to your gender specialist and get on the hormones. He just gave a prescription. So seeing these, testimonies and stories definitely causes some concern, right?
mhm
Especially as parents, people who, brothers, sisters, family members we care about may have life altering effects. And for most of these adolescents and young adults, they did detransition
mhm
after so many months. The average for those who are currently in the study at that time in 2016, they detransitioned within about 14 and a half months, right?
mhm
For those who are currently in the study, those who had already de-identified as trans, who said no longer I am male or female because I once identified as male or female, they they detransitioned at a longer pace. It was like 2 years.
mhm
So it's just very interesting that you have, a very wide range of experiences. But if detransitioning is happening at this rate, why, as someone who is a student administrator, not be informed? Is there a channel? Are there doctors coming also to your, resource center, educating these young adults, these college students, on the procedures of getting transitionary hormones and so forth? Like, how do you make sure that there's a proper railing so that young adults don't feel like one day they regret this?
Yeah, I think again, it all goes back to and I've only been in my position for 7 months, right? And so I don't have the numbers for you in terms of the studies that you were citing in terms of like the detransitioning. A lot of the stories and narratives, and we're actually advocating for gender affirming hormones because we don't have it yet, and so but we are slated to have it in the fall.
Okay. And how would
Whereas
it be given out to students? I'm very curious.
right, and so again, it's that informed consent model in terms of when they are going to a health provider and asking for gender affirming care, gender affirming like hormones, um, that the providers are educating the students about, again, like the effects. Here are the effects on your body, here are the possible risks, and again, trusting the students, because at the time that a college student um decides to seek out gender affirming care, gender affirming medication, or gender affirming hormones,
Mm.
we believe that they've done their research already, right?
Mm.
Like I mean, I honestly believe that because like if you look at other studies, people, and I can't cite any of the scholars now, but our
Yeah.
gender identity um is formed when we're around 3 or 4, right? And so there's like different anecdotes out there that like people have already known that, their sense of psychological self isn't matching their outward expression of themselves, and just kind of wanting those two things to align so that they can authentically be who they are, right? And
Mhm.
so I have a student who's in grad school, who has repressed their gender identity. And so there's also those stories. And so I think that there's a room, I'm always a believer that there's a room for both, and to honor and validate like each person's experiences, right? And so for trans people who decided that they are like I think you termed it detransition,
Right.
and who no longer identify as trans, that's their story, right? And that's their personal narrative. And I, highly respect that. And also, I don't want folks to use those stories to not give the gender affirming care
Hmm.
that, some of our trans and gender nonconforming need in order for them to be who they are and to be, fully authentic to themselves.
It's a good thing that you're there, to be able to show that support first and foremost. And hopefully for us who are researching this topic, we can be able to give you good information and
Yeah.
the affirmative care model works out or doesn't. Right now, I'm really hesitant about it. I believe that we
Mhm.
should take more conservative steps. And
Yeah.
I actually maybe like draw back even a little bit because there are people who may be hurt by this who are going to experience
Mhm.
that regret that we see, at least right now in the literature.
Mhm.
And until we get substantive research and literature
Mhm.
on this topic, whether it's regarded to surgery or hormones, because again, FDA has not approved of the cross-sex hormones, right? So once we
Mhm.
get that, I think hopefully we help you be able to do your job more fluently.
Right. And is your lab and research center also like studying folks who have found these gender affirming services and healthcare services life changing
Definitely.
and like positive and things
Mhm.
like that? Have y'all done that research as well in terms of
Yes.
following the lives of individuals who, receiving gender affirming care within the health industry has like literally saved their lives?
Right, right. I believe so. Yeah, looking at the literature that we have, we're starting up with a new study, and so
Mhm.
more to come on that. But
Yeah, yeah.
recent literature that we have seen with other individuals, at least for now, we don't have a lot of longitudinal studies. We need more of those. But right now, with the short term studies, there does seem to be an immediate effect. Some people, like Abigail Schreier, right, who is
Mhm.
very contentious in some of her writings, she's just trying to be a journalist and try to get some of these stories, in my opinion. And some of these people who are taking the cross sex hormones, you know, they often don't realize that it may lead to infertility and these other
Mhm.
issues. And as college kids, your brain isn't even fully developed yet. And if you're
Mhm.
allowing high schoolers to potentially take cross-sex hormones, right, the risk of cancer and other unknown risks, like again, having your uterus taken out, like that's not an easy thing to ever think about. So if we're hopefully, having that consent is always should be an option. But if we have the research to back up, this is effective 90%, 100% of the time. That would give us a lot of ease, I would say.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Hopefully we
Yeah, and
can
I
see
think
some good positive upturns with treatment.
yeah, definitely. I think, it's going to be an ever evolving journey. And yeah, like if yeah, like I have recently learned about the informed consent model, in my time here and things like that. And I feel like it's the most humanizing, model there is out there in terms of like really believing an individual and where they're at in their journey of life. And so, I definitely embrace the informed consent model, especially when providing gender affirming services, to our community. And I also, hear and understand, where you're coming from because of, the work and the research that y'all are doing.
Right.
Just kind of, again, the effects of transitioning and, the different like hormones and like what that, how that could affect like the body, and everything else. And so, there's no right or wrong answer. It's very complex.
Right.
But I
Yeah.
really want us to just really listen to and center, at least for me, at least the
Yeah.
way that I go about doing my job is really listening to like the needs of our students when they come to us,
Sure.
and believing that they have the capacity to make the decision for themselves and their bodies. And who are we as an institution to take that right away from them, in terms of, you know again, just receiving gender affirming care.
I want you to be able to just say a last word for, the people listening here. What do you hope to get out of, this conversation, or for those viewers, what do you hope to convey to them, in terms of community, in terms of intersectionality as a Christian lesbian woman, right? And Filipinx, how do you hope to enliven their lives, give them more meaning, and hopefully encourage them wherever they're at in terms of their sexuality, their struggles, and figuring out, this grand narrative.
Yeah, I think my final thoughts is that, each and every one of us really at the end of the day want to feel that we're valued, that we're loved, and that we're affirmed,
Mm.
for being who we are authentically. And to extend that to every person you meet in the LGBTQIA plus community, to suspend your fear because you don't know everything there is that needs to be known, or suspend judgment, open your heart and minds, and really build authentic relationships, by respecting and honoring and valuing the person that comes to you in ways that they want to be valued, in ways that they want to be loved, in ways that they want to be affirmed and supported,
Right.
right? Because we can't assume that how we show our love or support to any individual is the way that that individual wants us to show our love and care. And so there's really that putting an important emphasis on building that intentional relationship so that they can share with us and be vulnerable with us, in sharing how they want to be affirmed and valued and loved and cared for in our collective community.